Hello and welcome back. This is the week 7 lecture. So today I would like us to get started on Wieland, or The Transformation, by Charles Broughton Brown. This is a really bizarre, interesting text. I think it's a little bit frightening. A lot of modern readers find it to still be pretty genuinely scary. It also plays a very important role in early American literary history, as does Charles Broughton Brown, the author. So I wanted to start here with part one of this lecture, really just focusing on Brown and talking a little bit about his career, some of the things he did, and how he fits into the sort of, sort of the American literary scene in the 1790s. So we'll talk about Brown here in part one, and in part two, we'll actually jump into the text itself. So I ask you guys to just read basically the first half of Wieland this week. We're going to spend 2 weeks on it total. So this week, I just want you to get through the first 12 chapters, which takes us roughly to the halfway point of the overall book. And we will tackle the second half next week in week 8. So again, we'll get to the novel itself in part two. Let's start just by thinking a little bit about Brown, and I want to sort of put him into conversation with Susanna Rowson and Hannah Webster Foster, along with Brackenridge and all of these other early American authors that we've been looking at so far this semester. So just like these other early writers, Brown is active in the 1790s, and he's producing some of the first American novels. So we've already kind of looked at a variety of different types of popular genres for the early novel. So we've already seen some examples of sentimental fiction. The sentimental novel, obviously The Coquette, was sort of our introduction to that genre. I've also talked about some other popular sentimental works of that same time period. The first 3 best-selling novels ever written in America were The Coquette, Charlotte Temple by Susanna Rowson, and The Power of Sympathy by William Hill Brown, all sort of similar in terms of subject matter and overall style. So we've already talked about that. We also talked about historical fiction in reference to Reuben and Rachel by Rowson. So when we read that book, we talked about how historical fiction was another popular genre of the sort of early novel era throughout the 1700s in both England, and in the later 1700s, we start to see it show up here in America. But I also mentioned last week when we were talking about modern chivalry, I mentioned satirical novels and how this was another popular genre, or a sort of a popular mode of fiction, particularly novels. And we saw an example, of course, with Brackenridge's Modern Chivalry, and we talked about how he was influenced by all of these early English writers in ways similar to what we discussed in terms of Rowson and Foster and basically every other writer that we've studied so far. So Brown is doing some similar work. He is adapting genres and literary styles that were popular in England. Again, this is kind of the same old story for us. He's adopting these old world styles to the new world and new world situations, new world settings, and it's an interesting process to observe. Just like the sentimental novel changes a little bit when it gets brought over to America, the genre that Brown is working within also changes a bit when it comes to America. So Brown is using the Gothic romance genre here in Wieland. And just a quick note before I forget, this is the one time all semester that my edition is going to be different from the edition I ordered for you guys. So I'm not sure what happened. I just never got around to acquiring the more modern contemporary edition that I ordered for the class. So I'm still using this old 1920s edition with a very memorable cover. It's one of the first sort of definitive editions of the book that we have, but it's very old. It might still be in print, but I'm pretty sure I did not order it. So the edition that you guys have is more recent. I don't think there should be major changes in terms of the actual content, but obviously our pagination will be different, and I'm not going to require you guys to read any kind of intro, although I think there is an introduction to your edition. I'm pulling some of my presentation from the intro to this edition, but it really doesn't matter. I just won't be able to really give you page numbers as I talk about specific passages or scenes. But anyway, yeah, I was just holding it up, so I wanted to make clear that we do have different editions. But yes, this is an example of a Gothic romance, and the other really famous novel that Brown wrote that is still read and studied today, Edgar Huntley, is also an example of a Gothic romance. So if you took my 451 class a while back, you read Edgar Huntley, and you're already a little bit familiar with Brown. He wrote many other novels, but Wieland and Edgar Huntley are the two that are generally regarded today by most critics and scholars as the best and the most accessible, really, for college students. So Brown's an interesting guy. I just want to spend a little bit of time on him before we get into the text. So he was born into a Quaker family in Philadelphia in the 1770s, and he was, in many ways, maybe the first true American man of letters. That's a phrase that we might not hear very often anymore, man of letters. I just want to explain what that means. That was commonly used back in the 18th century and really through much of the 19th century as well. It was just kind of a general term used to refer to writers, obviously men primarily, writers who kind of did a number of different types of writing. So yeah, they would produce fiction, maybe novels. They would also produce poetry, maybe plays. They might also produce nonfiction, what we could think of as sort of early examples of journalism, or, essays, reviews of other literary works. They might have worked as editors. They might have created periodicals or magazines, literary journals. So a man of letters would have done a number of those things and kind of had a lot of different types of texts and a lot of different involvement in the world of writing and publishing, not strictly fiction writing. And Brown really does fit that description. Brown obviously produced novels. He also wrote some poetry, but he also wrote a lot of nonfiction, and he worked as an editor. He created a number of periodicals, what we might think of as early examples of like magazines, and again, sort of literary journals. Those still exist today. If any of you are fans of creative writing or do creative writing yourselves, you're probably familiar with some literary journals. A lot of them are, of course, online today. But Brown was kind of working in that same area, obviously a long time ago when the marketplace looked a lot different. But again, this is why he's important. He was really involved beyond just the fiction that he wrote. He is really involved in the creation of sort of an American literary scene, because as we've already discussed, here in the early days of the New Republic, we don't have a lot of established writers. We don't have a lot of established literary traditions yet. So Rowson is popular, but of course she's English born. Foster writes The Coquette, which is arguably better than a lot of what Rowson was putting out, but she publishes it anonymously. So she never really gets recognition during her lifetime. We talked about Brackenridge last week. He was an amateur writer, really, and people knew modern chivalry, but people knew him better as a judge and a minor sort of like political figure. So Brown is kind of unique in that even though he didn't make a living strictly off of his fiction, he does make a living almost entirely as a writer and an editor. he can't live off of his fiction alone, but he is this sort of all-purpose man of letters. And outside of maybe Rowson, I don't think we've seen anyone else who is really able to create a career like that in early America. And even Rowson is also a schoolmaster. She runs a school for girls. She works as an actress. So even she has other jobs and like other pursuits. Brown, many people say, is kind of setting the stage for future writers who are able to make a living strictly as writers. Brown is kind of a bridge between the old days where that really wouldn't have been possible, certainly not back in our colonial history. So he's like a bridge between those old days and the new literary world that he might be helping to sort of usher in. But what we remember him best for today would be the series of novels that he produces right at this hinge point between the end of the 18th century and the very beginning of the 19th century, and Wieland falls within that group. So he has this really productive stretch beginning at like the last few years of the 1700s where he produces some of his best work. So Wieland comes out in 1798, which I believe is the same year that Reuben and Rachel was published, and just 1 year after The Coquette came out. So these are all basically coming out in the same general time period. 1 year later, he publishes another one of his novels called Ormond, or The Secret Witness. Sounds kind of exciting. And then I believe the next year, also 1799, he publishes Arthur Mervyn, which is actually a pretty interesting book. If you guys like Brown and you've already read Edgar Huntley, you might want to go to Arthur Mervyn next. It's also weird, kind of hard to get through at times, but it's kind of a thriller, a little bit gothic, much like Wieland and Huntley. So that comes out in 1799. Edgar Huntley comes out in 1799. And then Brown publishes a couple of other books, more sentimental style books. Clara Howard and Jane Talbot, both named after their title characters. Both of those books come out in 1801. And then after 1801, he suddenly stops writing fiction. And I don't really know why. I mean, I haven't really read his letters. I think he explains this in some of his correspondence to like friends or whatever, but he basically just gets tired of writing fiction or decides that he's done all he can do with fiction. So he spends the last decade of his life continuing to work as an editor, continuing to contribute sort of short journalistic pieces or like essays to some of these periodicals, some of them that were his, and then others that he just, contributed to other people's publications. But that's pretty much all he does for the last decade of his life, and then he dies at a pretty young age, 39. He was a sickly guy throughout his life, so he dies in the year 1810 of tuberculosis. So he lives a short life, but a pretty productive career. And one thing that's interesting to note about him, this is kind of a footnote for us, but just worth pointing out, is he's sort of loosely connected to the Hartford Wits, a group of Connecticut-based poets that I talked about briefly. I think it was in either week 1 or week 2. We read a poem by Joel Barlow, The Hasty Pudding. Barlow was a member of the Hartford Wits. So this was one of the first real literary societies in America, in the newly independent nation. That's why we talk about them. We don't really read them much anymore. Barlow is the only one of that larger group who's really still remembered today, but they were kind of important in the 1790s, and I mentioned that Foster actually knew Barlow, and she knew of those guys. They were centered largely around, Hartford, obviously, it's where many of them lived, but also many of them were alums of Yale, which is in New Haven, Connecticut, where a lot of the action of the Coquette took place. So these guys were sort of a cultured, well-educated group. Many of them were Yale educated, and they largely produced sort of satirical works. They were largely poets, although some of them wrote essays and some prose fiction. But if you remember Barlow, the whole idea with The Hasty Pudding is he's writing in this what they called a mock sort of heroic style. So it was sort of like a funny version of like old epic poetry that you might have found in like ancient Rome and ancient Greece, and that kind of poetry had a revival in England in like the 16 and 1700s, and then by the end of the 1700s you had a lot of people satirizing it and doing mock heroic poetry where you have a hero and some of these epic themes, but it's all kind of goofy or silly, often because the subject matter is kind of silly, and that's what Barlow does, writing a poem about a popular type of food in America, but sort of using this heroic or epic poetic style. So that's the kind of stuff that these guys did. That's why they were called wits. They were supposed to be kind of funny. And they didn't write a lot of really important works outside of Barlow, who wrote Visions of Columbus, which is a pretty important early American epic poem, and he was playing it straight with that one. Like, he's not joking around. He's really treating Columbus and his discoveries as heroic, much like Rowson does. Although he doesn't change as much history around. He's just kind of, whitewashing, frankly. But that poem was popular in early America. So we remember some of Barlow's stuff, but not the rest of those guys. But anyway, Brown becomes friends with kind of a minor American poet and a guy who was loosely affiliated with the Wits, Elihu Hubbard Smith, who we don't read him anymore. We don't really remember him, but Smith was from Connecticut, and he knew the Wits, and he kind of was a peripheral member of their group. He published some poetry. He kind of hung out with them, but he's not really remembered as one of the central figures of that group. But he becomes friends with Brown when Brown is studying the law as a young man living in Philadelphia. He becomes friends with Smith. Smith introduces him to some of these other wits. Brown actually visits some of those guys up in Connecticut. Later, he spends some time living with Smith in New York City. He's sort of exposed to other writers. Again, this is a very early sort of version of the American literary scene. A lot of early writing in the new nation was being done in New England. Some of it was in New York City, but Brown really helps to accelerate literary culture in Philadelphia. And in some ways, Philadelphia had a more open society than a lot of parts of New England, which were still kind of influenced by their Puritan past. But Philadelphia was a bit more cosmopolitan in some ways. Like Boston, it was a big port, but it was growing a little bit faster at this point in American history. It was becoming a really major city. Actually already was by the time Brown comes along. So he's exposed to more ideas. He's kind of an experimental writer, and he's influenced by the wits, not so much stylistically. Brown's not very funny, really, at least not intentionally, but he's just kind of inspired by the fact that these are American writers creating their own literary journals. They're publishing their own works, and even though they're kind of borrowing styles from England, they are original in many ways, because again, like we've seen with earlier writers, they're using American subject matter, like Philip Freneau did, even going back to Phyllis Wheatley and some of those early poets that we saw. They're all kind of distinctive because even though they're using traditional forms and genres, simply writing about American subject matter was kind of novel and different and interesting. So Brown is inspired by a lot of these ideas sort of circulating throughout the 1790s. And then he becomes, again, a pretty important figure himself in terms of being an editor and creating a lot of periodicals. And he also becomes a critic. Some people consider him kind of the father of American literary criticism. He wasn't the first person to do that kind of work, but again, he's writing a lot. He has a lot of he has all these different, journals and magazines that he's affiliated with, and he's reviewing other people's work, other important early works in American literature. So he has, a hand in a lot of different things. as his career progresses. He's also really influenced by the writing and philosophy of this English figure, William Godwin, who we don't really remember anymore. He was kind of an important thinker and writer of that time, kind of a radical in some ways, kind of a free thinker, was kind of an anarchist, kind of rejected a lot of the traditional aspects of culture and society that would have still been accepted in England and America of this time. We only really remember him as the father of Mary Shelley, who went on to write Frankenstein. But she married Percy Shelley, a famous English romantic poet. And again, I want you guys to have a sense of all of this that's going on around Brown. The early 19th century was a fertile, in the end of the 18th, early 19th, this is a fertile sort of time, not so much in America, but you have the romantic poets in England, you have the beginnings of a literary scene in America, and this is all influencing Brown. So I'm going to be using the term romance quite a bit when describing some of his work, particularly Wieland, so I've already referred to it as a Gothic romance. That's the genre that he's operating in here. That's the genre that he's operating in with most of his novels. Arthur Mervyn, Edgar Huntley, not all of his novels, but a lot of them are considered Gothic romances. So let's break down what that term means. Now, we've talked about the romance as a pre-novelistic type of prose fiction. If you guys remember several weeks ago, I was talking about the romance as kind of an influence in some ways for later types of novels, but it kind of existed before what we think of as the modern novel. So romances usually featured sort of extraordinary or supernatural events, a lot of knights and lords going on heroic missions to save damsels or whatever. So again, this was popular throughout the Middle Ages, and this type of literature still existed in the 18th century, certainly. So Brown is kind of adapting certain aspects from those old romances, but then there's also the Gothic element, and you guys know what Gothic, themed or Gothic styled fiction usually looks like. We're talking about sort of dark or dismal atmospheres, castles, maybe ancient curses, oftentimes supernatural elements. And this was a very popular genre in England and other parts of Europe, and particularly throughout the 18th century. This is another type of a popular early novel genre. So in 18th century England, you had writers like Anne Radcliffe and Horace Walpole publishing popular sort of Gothic tales. Then these would be, scary. They're kind of like the predecessors of modern horror in many ways. They have a lot of tropes and elements that we would recognize, that we see all the time in modern horror films. And we're going to point out some of those as we get into Wieland in part 2 of this lecture. So this is an established genre. And it's they were often called romances because they would kind of harken back to those old romances from like the Middle Ages, where you had the supernatural, you had some of these heroic quests undertaken by well-born heroes, and a lot of that stuff would still appear later in the Gothic romances of the 18th century, but you'd have the scary castles and the dark stormy nights, which again, a lot of that was handed down from the earlier medieval chivalric romances that I've mentioned before. So Brown is operating within that established tradition. And a lot of American readers would have recognized it. They liked those kinds of books. They read Anne Radcliffe, and they would have known exactly what Brown was doing. But again, Brown is setting his Gothic romance in America. America didn't have old castles. America didn't have ancient families with terrible curses in their past. It was a different environment. It was a different culture. It was a different society. In America, we don't have a heritage of chivalric romances like they do in England and France and other parts of Europe. So again, we were inheriting a lot of this from England, but once you move it over to an American setting, an American subject matter, and American themes, the old genres start to look quite a bit different. So we're going to see how that plays out in Wieland, how Brown is able to adapt the Gothic romance to a new country, new settings, and new themes. So again, he's kind of anticipating, Brown is, a lot of future horror movie staples. And I want us to really pay attention to that as we move on. So a lot of early critics will talk about how in a lot of his Gothic romance works, Brown is sort of centering the action around what we might call a horror or a terror motif. And I want to explain what this term motif means, because I'm going to use it sometimes, and it's important that we know certain terminology, especially when we're thinking about what critics or scholars have said about some of these works that we're reading. So a motif, in kind of the traditional sense of the word, is a simple element or some kind of feature or device in a work of literature. Often it can be like a plot device that serves as the basis for an extended narrative. So in this case, just the idea of terror or characters becoming terrified, that's like the central motif. That's the element that drives a lot of the action in Wieland. And I think we can see that. So that's how the term was used traditionally. Now, in sort of less formal terms, we think about a motif as being sort of any conventional or reappearing device, incident, again, sort of a plot device, an object that appears often in certain genres or styles. So we can really use the term either way here, but if we're reading Wieland as like an early example of like horror fiction, back before we necessarily had that designation, if we think of Gothic romances as really being sort of predecessors of modern horror fiction, then we're going to see a lot of templates, a lot of conventions, a lot of motifs that Brown establishes or is playing with in Wieland that we still see today. But if we're thinking of a motif in the old-fashioned sense of just being a central element that kind of drives all the action, fear and terror, and not understanding what is happening can really be considered kind of the driving engine here. Brown was very interested in natural phenomena that could not be explained by the science of the 1790s, or at least could not be very adequately explained. So if you read Edgar Huntley, you remember that he was very interested there in sleepwalking. And here in Wieland, he's interested in multiple phenomena. Spontaneous combustion, ventriloquism, to name the two most prominent. So he gets a lot of mileage out of these kind of unexplained natural phenomenon that maybe science was still kind of grappling with back then. Now we have explanations for most of those things, and Brown himself will try to provide some explanations by the end of his narratives, because he often likes to include some kind of moral or lesson that readers can take away from the story. So ultimately, he does sort of try to account for all of this weird, spooky stuff, but for most of the story, for most of the novels, the characters don't know, they don't understand, and maybe we don't fully understand either. So because they don't understand what's happening around them, because they don't have sort of logical, rational explanations immediately available to them, the characters are often quite scared and confused. Again, that's true in a lot of Brown's work. That's why it's this recurring feature or element that really becomes characteristic of all of Brown's work, and will later really become characteristic of an entire genre, if we're thinking about the sort of codification or the creation of a modern horror aesthetic as we think of it today. Again, I think Brown is very much involved in that process. But also, he writes sentimental novels as well. Some of his work has a more sentimental vein, so he's not only operating in a Gothic romance register, sometimes he kind of shifts into a more sentimental style. And we see some of that in the first half of Wieland as well, with a lot of the dramatic action circling around Clara. And her virtue is threatened. Her reputation is attacked towards the end of the first half. So these are plot devices that should have felt familiar to us, because they're somewhat similar to some of what we saw in The Coquette and other examples of sentimental fiction that we've discussed. But here there's a supernatural element that arguably makes it even more disturbing and sort of scary, and it might also carry some more symbolic weight as we think. And we'll visit this scene in part 2, but as we think about exactly what Carwin is trying to do at certain points in relation to Clara. So we'll get to that. But there are influences from Samuel Richardson and seduction plots, those early sentimental novels that I've mentioned before. But then again, there's that obvious Gothic influence as well. So Brown is kind of combining genres. He's doing some interesting, almost experimental work here, which is part of the reason we still study Wieland today. So before I wrap up here in part 1, I just want to point out some things that you should look for as we discuss the first half of the novel in part 2. So there's really 3 sort of terrifying devices at work in this book. The 3 devices that create the most terror or the most horror. And again, everything kind of revolves around the terror and the inexplicable nature of a lot of what's happening to our main characters, particularly early on as they're kind of grasping for answers. So there's kind of 3 main devices, or 3 kind of sources of a lot of this terror. Number 1, the spontaneous combustion of the elder Wieland. And we'll talk more about that. That happens very early in the book. Okay, so that's frightening. Number 2, the ventriloquism of Carwin. And that obviously has a lot of importance as the plot unfolds. And then finally, number 3, the religious mania of perhaps both Wielands, the elder Wieland, who dies early on, and his son, the younger Wieland, who is the title character of the book. Even though I would argue that Clara could make a case for perhaps being the protagonist just as much as her brother, but clearly they are sort of the centerpieces. So he eventually succumbs to a form of madness, not unlike what happened to his father. So we haven't really gotten to that yet, but we can certainly discuss that more in part 2 when in next week's lecture when we're covering the second half of the novel. So those are the 3 sort of well springs of the terror, of the horror, and we can walk through each one of those devices as we continue to get through the book. But the final thing I'll say here in part 1 of this week's lecture is just a quick note about Brown's style, which I find to be a little frustrating at times, perhaps unintentionally comical at times, but I'm always surprised. A lot of students really don't seem to mind his style. Some actually seem to enjoy it, but it's certainly old-fashioned in a way that we might expect from a novel written at the end of the 1700s. But a lot of critics will consider his style to be kind of ornate, a little bit overdone, very wordy. He uses a lot of words to describe oftentimes relatively simple things. We can call his prose kind of florid, inflated. These are all descriptors that have been used in the past. But also, he was a real student of Greek and Latin. So if any of you took Latin in high school, you might recognize that his syntax and even his word choice in some ways is kind of Latinized in ways that I can't really articulate, but critics have pointed that out. And he's also he's really guilty of what we call circumlocutions. I don't know if you guys know what that word means. A circumlocution is just an instance where a lot of words are used, where few words may have done the job just fine. So basically, it's being very verbose. It's giving long-winded answers that often don't, or just providing long-winded explanations that often don't really say much. It's a lot of words, it's a lot of verbiage, but they often don't do a lot. So the implication oftentimes with circumlocutions is the idea that the speaker or the writer might be trying to be evasive. Like they're trying to be vague, or they're trying to not really answer a question, or not really provide a clear answer or a portrait. You know, that they're sort of being vague and wordy and unclear. And sometimes people accuse Brown of that, and I think that's fair, but I think we have to decide as readers if that's always an accident. Is that always a mistake? Is Brown always just sort of a victim of an old-fashioned style and a kind of Latin-influenced style that doesn't really track as modern to our ears? Or does he sometimes write that way because he wants to be evasive, because he wants to be a little bit vague? Remember, the characters are often sort of enveloped in this mystery. They're confused. A lot of what's happening to them is inexplicable. They don't have explanations, even though they're cultured, well-educated people. So perhaps Brown wants the readers to have a similar experience, and maybe he wants us to often feel a bit confused, a bit in the dark. I think that kind of fits in to his genre and some of his larger intentions. But again, by the end of the book, I think he wants to tie up the loose ends, answer our questions, and explain these natural phenomenon that have been vexing the characters throughout, but we're obviously not there yet. So that's it for part one. We'll come back in part two, and we'll actually get into the text.